Hi, good afternoon, evening. Can you hear me okay? Yeah. Firstly, thank you to the Green Office for organizing this. I thought I should just introduce myself very briefly. I walked across the little bridge from the psychology department where I'm based. I spent the last 20 years or so studying emotions. So that's sort of my day job, my bread and butter, if you like. And in the last few years, I've gotten increasingly interested in and concerned about issues to do with sustainability. And so I'm here with several hats on, both my emotion researcher hat, my climate researcher hat, and also my environmental campaigner hat. I'm involved in a group called Scientists for Future, which does climate-related campaigning, and I'll mention a little bit of the work that we've been doing later on. You're very welcome to just raise your hand and ask questions throughout if anything is not clear, and there should be plenty of time at the end for Q&A as well. All right, in our day-to-day lives, we are constantly bombarded with images like this, with terrible, upsetting news in general, but also in particular relating to increasingly frequent and severe droughts and hurricanes and storms and heat waves, wildfires, you name it. And of course, biodiversity loss accompanying these changes. I am going to assume that you are aware that we are in a climate and ecological crisis and that you don't need any further information to alarm you about that fact. And so what I want to talk about today is what does that do to us and what do we do from where that brings us. But maybe just to check in with you, how many of you would describe yourselves as feeling worried about the climate? Yeah, okay. So that's already one piece of information you've got, which is you're not alone. Lots of other people are concerned too. And that is something that is going to turn out to be pretty important. This is, I think, a very nice paper that came out a couple of years ago where they surveyed 10,000 young people, so people between 16 and 25 years, from 10 different countries, both countries that are more commonly studied in psychological research, like the USA and the UK, France, etc., but also countries in the global south that are far too often not included and considered. So they also included Brazil, India, Nigeria, and the Philippines. So very different parts of the world, very different, obviously, situations in many ways. But what was quite striking is that people everywhere are worried. So what you can see here is that the big chunks are extremely worried, moderately worried, and very worried, and only quite thin slivers are either not worried or a little worried. So most young people around the world seem to be somewhere in the range of being worried. Now, that is very psychologically taxing, as you all know. It is exhausting to exist in a state of constant, kind of chronic worry. However, finding community with other people who share your worries is actually the key to getting us onto a better path, and that's something that I'll return to later. So this is a general picture across, so just averaging across these 10 countries, because they were relatively similar, but it was noticeable that the respondents in the global south were reporting being more worried than people in the global north, except Portugal. People in Portugal were also very worried. And I don't know if you guys remember, but around that time, there were very severe wildfires in Portugal, and so the authors think that that might be the reason why young people in Portugal at that particular time at least were especially worried. Of course, worry is only one emotion, you could say. And in that very same study, they also asked about quite a range of other emotions. So, are you feeling sad? Are you feeling afraid? Are you feeling powerless? And more than half of the respondents reported also feeling a sense of sadness, helplessness, anxiety, fear, and so on. So this really is quite a wide range of emotions that the climate is eliciting in young people today. And the least often endorsed emotions was feeling indifferent or optimistic. This is really high numbers, like just in absolute terms. Most of the time, if you ask people how they're feeling, most people on average report feeling fine, pretty good, like 6 out of 10. And that is strikingly not the way that young people are feeling about climate today. So that's sort of the starting point. Now, as an emotion researcher, I of course find it interesting to, dissect the difference between feeling guilty and feeling ashamed. But in general, we can use more of an umbrella term to describe these feelings, namely something like climate distress. That just means feelings of worry and or anxiety and or depression relating to the climate and ecological crises. And sometimes you'll see eco-depression or climate depression. These are sort of fairly interchangeable terms that are trying to capture these feelings. And I think climate distress is important to understand because it really characterizes our everyday experience. But they're also important to understand because our emotions are really key to our actions. So we decide on what we're going to do or not do based on how we are feeling and how we expect to feel when we engage in different kinds of actions. So we also need to understand our feelings in relation to the climate because it's going to shape how we act. And so emotions are intrinsically about things we care about. If we don't care about something, we don't get emotional about it. And so I think this figure that I'm going to set out to you in stages is a nice representation that sort of summarizes this relationship between our feelings and our actions in this space. So an important factor is biospheric value. So to what extent do we identify with and care about the planet and its living systems? The more we care about that, the more worried we tend to be about climate change. Now, we can be worried about the climate for many reasons. Some of them are to do with our own, let's just say quality of life, survival, or, how our world will look for ourselves and people close to us. But we can also have broader concerns about other species living on the planet, for example. Now, the more worried we are about climate change, the more we tend to feel a sense of personal responsibility to do something about it. And also, the more we care about the planet, the more we tend to feel like it's partly up to us to try and do something to protect it. And the more we feel that sense of personal responsibility, the more we tend to be inclined to act in our everyday lives to take climate action. And it's also linked to supporting political policy changes that would protect the climate. So our feelings aren't just something that we momentarily experience, they also really drive the kinds of decisions that people make when they vote or when they take other kinds of actions that are relevant to the climate. But these emotions are actually quite new. People haven't been worried, they haven't had reason to be worried for very many decades about the climate. And so both as a phenomenon to experience, we don't really have a lot of knowledge about it. And we also don't, from a kind of scientific point of view, yet know that much about it. But we have already started to realize that climate distress or anxiety is different in some ways from other types of anxiety. So if we think about something like social anxiety, if you come to a therapist and you are socially anxious, the starting point for them is that you think that everybody is looking at you and thinking what you're doing is unusual and strange, and that is not true, right? So it's based on a false belief. If you are like Taylor Swift and you go to somebody and you say, I feel like everybody's looking at me, that's not pathological, that's just a fact, right? So for other types of anxiety, the starting point for us to call this anxiety is that it is based on a belief that is not true. And that has knock-on effects for the fact that we then consider these feelings that this person is having a sort of type of pathology, at least if it reaches a certain level of intensity and it hampers their everyday life. This is a bit different from climate anxiety, which is not based on an untrue belief. It's reflecting the actual severity of the situation. And there's therefore quite a bit of discussion in the literature about, should we consider this pathological to feel climate anxiety, or is it actually a kind of rational reaction to a real threat? Now, if we think about treatments of anxieties, they tend to be based on CBT-type approaches, so cognitive behavioral therapy, and a central part of that is reappraisal. So trying to persuade the person who is anxious that the threat is less severe than they believe it to be. In the context of climate anxiety, there is a question whether that is a reasonable approach. You might actually be bringing the person's assessment then away from a truthful evaluation of the severity of the threat. Is that appropriate, and is it likely to be effective? So the jury is still out on this. Like I said, it's really a new phenomenon for us as scholars to try and understand, as well as humans. But if CBT is then maybe not the most likely effective approach, what then can we do? Because even if in general climate anxiety per se is not considered pathological, it can certainly be something that prevents people from living a good life, that is paralyzing people or distressing them to the point that it's really, really bad for them. So how then can we manage stress? This is something that emotion researchers have been thinking about for many decades. And so I wanted to briefly introduce to you the classic theory by Richard Lazarus of stress and coping. So this starts with a stressor. And it's a very general kind of theory that essentially should capture how we cope with any type of stressor. It doesn't matter whether it's the kind of stressor that's like an exam coming up tomorrow or the climate crisis, right? It's just a stressor in this model. So according to Lazarus, what happens when we encounter a potential stressor is that we engage in something called the primary appraisal, which just means we evaluate it. And specifically, we ask ourselves, of course, implicitly, he's not suggesting we sit down and do this on paper, but we ask ourselves the question, does this thing, this potential stressor, pose a threat? That's the first thing we need to evaluate. Now, if it doesn't pose a threat, we don't need to cope. The process ends there. We go about our day. Very nice. If, however, we think it is a threat or a potential threat, then we go to the next step of the evaluation process, which is, according to Lazarus' theory, a secondary appraisal, which basically is asking the question, what resources have I got to deal with it? So can I manage this threat? So the outcome of this secondary appraisal is what's going to be important for determining how we cope. So there are a couple of different ways in which we can cope. This is obviously a really simplified picture of the world, but I think it captures something quite helpful. So either we evaluate that we have sufficient resources to deal with this stressor. Stressor is a combination of threat and stressor. It's late in the day. Okay, so if we imagine that the stressor is an exam, and you ask yourself first the question, does the stressor pose a threat? Well, it poses a threat to my ability to graduate if I fail, so kind of yes. And then what resources do I have to deal with it? Okay, I was at the lectures, I made some notes, I have those notes, great. I have access to the video recordings and the textbook. Okay, I have the sufficient resources to address this threat. I can revise, the exam isn't until the day after tomorrow. Then you would engage in something called problem-based coping. And that means basically making a plan and executing it to deal with the stressor. So in this case, you would revise for the exam and you would ace it. And that would be great. On the other hand, if you come to the conclusion that you do not have sufficient or appropriate resources to deal with this stressor, let's say you didn't attend any of the classes, you forgot to buy the textbook, and the dog ate your friend's notes that they shared with you. Yeah, what do you do then? You can't really engage in problem-based coping. You are kind of stuck with emotion-based coping, and that can take a few different forms. You might distance yourself. You might be like, it's not that important. What's a degree? You know, it'll be fine. You might engage in wishful thinking. Oh, I wish I didn't have that exam. Or you might try to think of the positive. Like, well, at least I had a great time when I didn't go to the lesson. As you can probably infer, none of these are helping you much deal with the stressor. So they're not considered very effective coping strategies. So I recommend to you engaging, whenever possible, in problem-based coping, meaning you make a plan and you try to execute it. So if then what we want to do is engage in problem-based coping, that leads us to ask, what is it we should be doing? What is in this plan? And the answer is basically everything, because we need everything. Every possible skill and inclination and motivation you have is needed. And these kaleidoscope glasses are just trying to illustrate that depending on which angle you're looking at, it can have lots of different shapes and lots of different colors, and nothing is necessarily better or worse than something else. It's about finding the way to act that is going to align with your inclinations and interests. Now, a bit more systematically, researchers have identified 5 different domains or roles in which you can take action. And so I think the most intuitive maybe, or the one that is discussed most often, is the role as consumer. So you can change what you buy, like basically buy less stuff, you can eat more plant-based, you can cut down or eliminate flying, etc. I think these are things that are quite familiar to many people. We less often talk about these other 4 roles in which we can also make a difference. So one of them is in the domain of investments. Now, not that many of you are likely to be millionaires, but you can, nevertheless, move whatever money you do have to a sustainable bank. You could also think about what organizations you're involved with or institutions you're associated with and who they bank with, and maybe you could start that conversation in that context. Or maybe you know some people who have more money than you do, and you could talk to them about who they bank with, because banks lend money to, for example, fossil fuel companies that then use that for exploration. You can also be a role model. We know that a lot of people do what a lot of other people do, right? So how we behave can be contagious and can change norms about what behaviors are considered kind of acceptable or common or deviant. 20 years ago, it was much more weird to be vegan than it is now in many parts of the world. So these things change, and that makes it easier for other people to change their behaviors too. Then we are also organizational participants. We are at the UFA now. We can think about how we can change our own institution and the practices, like the guidelines for different kinds of how do we organize events, for example? What are the rules around flying? Is the canteen serving only plant-based meals, etc.? You could join the Green Office, right? There are lots of things you can do at the institutional level. And then, of course, unfortunately very topical, you can also act as a citizen, and that is not limited to just voting, but you can also contact people who are in a position of power, like your representative at the local or national level. You could consider running for office. You don't have to run to be an MP. There are lots of local roles that also make a big difference. So with all that said, I think the most important thing that's ever been said about what you can do about climate change comes from a very, very wise man called Bill McKibben, who set up 350.org, which some of you might have heard of. He's been a climate campaigner since before even I was born, and long before all of you were born. And he said, the best thing you can do about climate change as an individual is to stop acting like an individual. And I think this is profoundly true. As an individual person, the kind of change you can initiate or create is always going to be limited. But what we can do together is much more than the sum of its parts. And so just to illustrate that, I wanted to mention a campaign that I was involved in a few years ago in my work with Scientists for Future. And we worked on this campaign together with many other groups. So this was a campaign for ABP to divest from fossil fuel companies. So ABP is the biggest pension fund in the Netherlands, one of the biggest in the world. They have over 450 billion euros in investments. I know, you can't even imagine a number that big. And they're the pension funds of all academics in the Netherlands and many other civil servants in the Netherlands. And like I said, it is the largest pension fund in the Netherlands. Actually, the largest in Europe even. And starting in 2014, there was a campaign to demand that ABP not have any of those 460-something billion euros in fossil fuel companies. They had about 15 billion euros in fossil fuel companies at the time when this campaign started. And what I have here are some pictures of different kinds of actions that were done by many different groups. So there was a massive petition that was done with ABP pension savers who wanted ABP to divest. And that's what's being handed over to the, at the time, the chairwoman of ABP in the top left. In the top right, you can see a demonstration. On the top left, you can see a picture from a group that occupied the headquarters of ABP. And I think this one is a very creative action. You cannot see this so well, but if I tell you, you will see it. This is actually a bunch of professors wearing a toga or each wearing a toga, not all together wearing one toga. So this is a bunch of professors who are standing wearing their togas, and it's in the form of a clock, like it's 5 to 12, like we're running out of time. So this was like this kind of stunt that they did that got a lot of media attention to bring out the message of why all these professors wanted their pension fund to divest from the fossil industry. On the bottom right, you can see an announcement that Fossil Free, who was one of the leading groups campaigning on this issue, were preparing a court case against ABP to basically sue them, because pension savers don't have the option to change pension funds. Anyway, we also had meetings with members of the ABP board, with the Nederlandse Bank, the regulator of pension funds in the Netherlands, and so on and so forth. So lots of different actions. We, as Scientists for Future, also put pressure on the university boards. 3 years ago, almost exactly, like 3 years and a week or something like that, ABP announced that they would divest from fossil fuels. And they have now pretty much completed the selling off of 15 billion euros worth of assets from fossil fuels. So this is not one group that made this happen. It wasn't one action. There was no silver bullet. It was the sustained campaigning of many different groups with many different theories of change and ideas about the best actions. And all of that together put so much pressure on ABP that they made a 180 from being very clear that they would not divest to actually giving in to the demands of their own pension savers in this case. So this is just to illustrate the importance of community and many people sharing a concern and working together to take action. So I wanted to invite you to think about what kind of action you could take. And I really like this approach developed by the marine biologist Ayana Elizabeth Johnson. She suggests that we think about what brings us joy. Like, what kind of stuff do you like doing? If you're going to take action, and for that to be sustainable in itself as a part of your life, it needs to involve stuff that you actually like doing. You also obviously need to think about, what does the world need? Like, oh, I really enjoy doodling. That's great for you, but it's not going to help anybody else. So we also need to take into consideration what is needed, and we need to think about, what are you good at? What can you bring? And she suggests that in the middle, that's the piece of the puzzle, that's you. And so I wanted to take, say, like 3 minutes for you guys to sit down and actually have a think about, what could you put in that puzzle piece. I, for reasons of sustainability, did not bring paper for all of you. I trust that most of you will have like a mobile phone on you, or a piece of paper of your own. So I would invite you to have a quick think about, what could you possibly find in that central space. So I'll give you, say, 3 minutes for that. All right. Hopefully some of you might have some thoughts about what's in that puzzle piece for you. If not, it's something that you might consider pondering after we leave today. And importantly, find other people who share your idea of what is needed and who appreciate the things that you're good at. That way you will enjoy it much more and be much more effective. A final thing that I want to leave you with today is to remind you that I think acting for the climate has kind of a bad reputation. It's seen as something that is, you know, just compromising on all the pleasures of life. You know, we're all going to be like knitting our own Birkenstock and eating alfalfa 90% of our diet or something. And there is growing evidence that acting pro-environmentally is actually associated with better psychological well-being. And so this has been shown in more general terms in pro-social behavior. So sharing with others, helping others is associated with boosts to well-being. And that feeling that you get when you act in a way that aligns with your values, that is doing good for others, has been called warm glow. And in the context of pro-environmental actions, it's sometimes been called green glow. I don't love that term. It sounds a little radioactive to me. But anyway, if you encounter these terms, you now know what they refer to. And I think what is particularly exciting about the possibility of people actually feeling good when they're doing good is that it gives the potential for a virtuous cycle. So if we engage in pro-environmental behavior, we might feel good. And that means that the next time we think about engaging in that behavior again, we are going to anticipate that we will feel good if we do it. And therefore, we are much more likely to do it. And so you can see how just like you can fall into doom loops in lots of different domains, it is also possible to fall into this kind of positive, self-reinforcing, virtuous cycle. And of course, or not of course, but it seems from what we know so far that kind of any pro-environmental behavior can give you this warm glow, but there's nothing stopping you from starting with this easy stuff that you enjoy intrinsically. So my suggestion would be to start with the things that gives you the biggest positive emotion boost when you do them, and then probably that will sort of expand organically. To wrap up, these are my takeaways. You're not alone in feeling anxious. In fact, you're probably in the majority, especially among younger people, but also in general, and that's going to be key for creating change. Acting together with others can help both in practical terms make you more effective, but also it provides a lot of socio-emotional support. And don't forget, it can also be fun. Thank you. I think I'm contractually obliged to show you this colloquium point thing, but we can also do Q&A maybe first, so you don't have the opportunity to run off. Questions, thoughts, reflections, criticisms, disagreements? Just general exhaustion, yeah? Yeah, good question. I think several things. to me, it's quite strange that I ended up working on sustainable finance, because I definitely didn't go into academia because I love thinking about money. But to me, it got me more excited and interested to think about these complex kind of structural issues. And so I guess in a way that's also where I found myself. I think I also really like people. So one of the other roles I see myself as having is connecting people and organizing events that allow people to meet each other and connect with each other. So that's maybe a couple of my puzzle pieces. But that's not to say that those are going to be yours. I mean, the finance thing, I find it weird too. Like, yeah.
I think like a big thing with regards to sustainability, or like, you know, how to tackle climate change, is that it is really intersectional. However, it's really hard for, like, you know, from having our major, for example, like in psychology, to be able to target it while still trying to practice it. How do you think it's the best way as students to be able to try to get into the topic while still try to do our studies?
Yeah, that is a great question, and it's something that I also struggled with. I wasn't a student, but I was a researcher, and my research had nothing to do with climate or sustainability. And so I found myself in the evenings reading like environmental psychology papers that seemed like kind of I was doing an extra job on the side. And so for me, I spent a few years just trying to kind of educate myself, essentially. And I didn't see an obvious way to connect the different parts of my life, my campaigning work and my research. And at some point, that started to develop quite naturally. And now I have a handful of research projects that do connect these worlds. So maybe a part of it is patience. Like, it's okay to have multiple different trajectories. They don't always, I mean, I also have friends who are also campaigners, and their research is so disconnected that they really cannot find ways to bind these things together, and that's okay. Like, your studies don't have to be sustainability tinged, but of course, it can be very insightful if you can merge your worlds and your identities and your expertise. But some of that might have to come over time. So I was involved in a group, and we wanted to apply for some funding. And then everybody was kind of looking at each other going, oh, writing a proposal for like funding. And I was like, oh my God, this is like, I do this a lot. And I would never have thought that that was a transferable skill. It seems like one of those weird things that academics do that like doesn't apply in the real world. And suddenly it turned out that I actually had like, hey, I had a useful skill. So maybe also kind of having a really open mind that it can take many different forms, these opportunities to kind of connect your different domains of expertise and identity. But I think the intersectionality is also really important when we think about like, what can you bring? What are you good at? It can also be you're adding a perspective that maybe other people don't have. That seems also very important.
So I think the presentation you gave us kind of points to how you think, or how you argue that emotion drives action, like because there's kind of anxiety that action should follow. And I'm wondering what you think about people who see this as maybe more of a social dilemma, as in they are worried, they are concerned, but if everyone else is worried and concerned, and they want to put in the effort, then I might not put in as much effort, precisely because I just want to save myself. And if everything ends up being well anyways, then might as well just put in less effort for myself. I think it is.
That is kind of where we're at. Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, sure.
Is it possible to
Um, I think there are lots of different ways in which people cope, and not all of them are great. So one of the ways in which people cope is just try to not think about it, right? Which might momentarily help, but doesn't really help structurally deal with the problem. I would be inclined to say that there is a big chunk of the population that is worried and isn't really that sure where to channel their concern and their energy. There are also people who are denying it's a problem, etc. They're here, not that many, and I would not advise dedicating time and resources to, getting those people to change their views. I think rather starting with the people who are concerned and who would maybe be motivated to do something, but a lot of people are just not really sure where to start, and that becomes this sort of choice overload situation. There's so many things and there's so much conflicting information that people just kind of throw up their hands and don't really know what to do. So that's why I think thinking about these 5 different roles and then trying to find something that actually feels vaguely appealing for yourself, I think these things do tend to become sort of self-perpetuating, that if you start a little bit, so maybe it's also about taking small steps. And I think also some people think, oh, a climate activist, oh, now I have to go and glue myself to the road, and that's not, who I am, or it doesn't appeal to me for any of a range of reasons. And so maybe also getting people to think about the fact that there are lots of things they can do that are like very small threshold, and then maybe go from there, right? So not starting with this huge ask of like you have to change your whole identity and lifestyle and everything, but start with something small that doesn't seem so unappealing. Discover that actually it kind of makes you feel good, and then that, I think, will set the ball rolling.
Is there evidence showing that people who are more proactive on climate issues become less anxious about it? Because you would think that the people who are most active are also the most worried about it.
Yeah. Ask me again in a few years, and we'll hopefully have better data. There's not very much longitudinal data on climate activists, but there are certainly studies showing that, like a correlation. And there's a little bit of research showing a causal effect. So there have been some intervention studies where people were told to act more pro-environmentally than they usually do, and it improved their well-being. So these are not necessarily, it's not necessarily like one continuum of climate distress and well-being, right? So you can have climate distress, but also high well-being. And I would guess that that's probably what's going on. So you're thinking about it all the time. So it's not like you are not worried about it, but you also feel like it's meaningful. You're doing something, you're contributing, you're connected to others, and that then improves your psychological well-being. Yeah. But I think this is definitely something very interesting to study more, and different kinds of actions might also work differently. So it might depend how costly it is, what you're doing. Like if you're changing something very fundamental about your lifestyle, that might have a different effect than some very minor change.
I was also wondering how the general attitude is amongst staff members at the university, because so Sebastian and I are from the Green Office, for those of you who don't know. And I think when we show up to events like Interlake, places where we present ourselves, we're often given a lot of comments or I guess backlash also, where people feel very threatened by us being there, because it's kind of like a reminder, right? Like that climate change exists, and there's an organization there next to ING giving out free calculators or batteries, yeah. And I was wondering if it kind of translates amongst would you like to confront the editor, or?
Yeah. Yes, I think there's a fair chunk of the population, including faculty, who would prefer to just not think too much about it. And like there are different kinds of hope, right? There is hope that involves some kind of action, like more like determination. Like I hope we can improve things if we all work really hard and coordinate well. And there's hope, like I hope somebody will figure out how to deal with this. And I'm feeling like there's quite a lot of the second kind of hope around, people who are concerned, but at the same time have this vague sense of optimism that, I don't know, geoengineering or some technological breakthrough will just fix it. Yeah, I also get that. But that's also not to say that people cannot shift, and also why it's so important to find the people who are engaged and active, and then gradually grow that group. And like we can all despair if we just think about like all the people who aren't doing enough. I mean, nobody's doing enough, arguably, but some people really aren't doing enough. And so I think start where you are and start with the like proximate goals, right? And then many of these things, like I said, most people just do what other people do. So once you get enough people on board, then a whole lot of people will follow with any given behavior, pretty much, for better or worse. And hopefully we can use that for better. Yeah. But I have to say that also the like UvA leadership has taken some quite substantial steps, which also does something to set the norms. And you do see people in important leadership roles at the UvA who are taking a stand and doing real things. I mean, I was quite happy when I saw like the green office, the green paper that then became the white paper. I was expecting it would just be like abolish plastic straws, which like we should, but we should not stop there, of course. But they were actually talking about, you know, like how do we heat our buildings and things like that that are really much more impactful. So I think that there is some evidence that the leadership is taking this seriously and they're putting proper resources towards it. That's not to say that 100% of the faculty are on board, far from it, but it is quite important what signals are being sent by the board in this case.